This lecture turns to the so-called restoration of the monarchy, the period after which Napoleon is deposed, and what happens when the Bourbon monarchs are put back on the throne. This period is dominated unequivocally by Romanticism, that style that arose in opposition to the logical approach to neoclassicism, very appropriate for a period of turmoil and of settling after Napoleon. Now, Napoleon's Russian campaign marked the beginning of the end in 1812, as he prepared to attack Russia, but did not complete the task before winter set in. At this time, his grand army of 435,000 were reduced to 10,000. As we find here, after the army is going to be decimated, nations begin revolting that he had conquered, and there was increased resistance in France itself to Napoleon's rule. Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI, called himself King of France since 1795 while in exile. In 1814, after the ousting of Napoleon, he hastened back to France to reclaim the throne, establishing a constitutional monarchy whereby he would share power with a bicameral parliament, much as though they had in England. And this would ensure that there would not be another uprising or claim that there was not representation for the Third Estate. Therefore, during this Bourbon Restoration period, or the Restoration period, that runs between 1814, marking the Napoleon being out of power, and 1830, the July monarchy, we have a period that is relatively conservative and reactionary by nature. The first order of business for King Louis would be to restore the monuments of the monarchy that had been destroyed during the Revolution or Napoleon's era, and revive the glory of this Bourbon dynasty that had come before it. Thus, we're looking to reclaim and repair Versailles and the Abbey of Saint-Denis, which had been the burial place for French kings, and thus elevating their significance. He also is going to replace royal statues that had been knocked down during the Revolution. He erected statues destroyed as well in the Revolution, such as that by or of Henry IV, who had ruled from 1589 to 1610, the first of the Bourbon kings, which he placed on the Pont Neuf, or the New Bridge. He also melted down images of Napoleon for propaganda as well, much as we would have seen Napoleon on the Place Vendôme column. This would be melted down for Bourbon propaganda. A monument that sums up how the new king felt the people of France should behave towards them can be seen in the Chapelle Expatriée, which is the expiatory chapel, here produced by Pierre-François Léonard Fontaine. In this particular chapel, built between 1816 and 21, we have this built on the grounds where Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were buried. Now, expiation is much more common in the Catholic religion, and remember, the French are Catholic. And here they're looking to atone for their sins. Here, a symbolic atonement for the French people's sin of guillotining their king and queen. So forcing a type of expiation or of attrition, if you will, on the French people. Now here, Fontaine is going to be the first imperial architect who becomes the royal architect and produces a centralized dome structure that combines Greco-Roman, Etruscan, Renaissance, and medieval styles here in what is very common in the Restoration era, eclectic historicism. That is whereby you take elements from many different periods to put them together in order to, of course, communicate something, in this instance, that they are the inheritors of these great traditions. On the interior, we have a move away from neoclassicism that was very popular during the Revolution and with Napoleon, and instead we are replacing it with the pre-revolutionary past, one seen in the Baroque. The interior is meant to remind one of the interior of the Pantheon. This one even includes the bronze rosettes that were melted down by Bernini to make the baldacchino. Now, as you can see, the figure of Marie Antoinette seeking solace with religion is going to be very close to the particular styles that are appropriated by Bernini in trying to draw the viewer in with this allegorical figure alongside a real historical figure, just like the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. Here, religion, interestingly enough, is in the neoclassical style, stable and upright, very simplistic, whereas Marie is going to be in the Baroque style, who is much more emotional, especially with her cloak. Thus, we have this interest in historicism noted again, bringing together different styles in order to communicate something new. Yet, in attempting to recapture the glories of Louis XIV or Louis XIV, we find that Louis XVIII is somewhat lacking in both his artistic credentials and in his presentation. Now we can see how he is attempting to show himself as a direct heir to the Sun King with the same position, the very powerful stance that he is in, the right hand on this very powerful rod, the crown beside it. But instead, Louis XVIII is going to have his left hand out, inviting the spectator in. A much more open kind of understanding of absolutism in this new monarchy. Yet it fails to inspire, for he seems somewhat overweight and overburdened by his costume. In 1816, we find here that he restored the pre-revolutionary Royal Academy as the new Académie des Beaux-Arts, or the Academy of Fine Art in France. Now, this new academy would be dominated by David's students, Gros, Gerard, and Ingres. This academy controlled the teachings, faculty, entrances, student competitions, and even the public salons. Now, previously, this had been dominated by young artists when David started out, for instance, but now they were graying artists past middle age, which we know would serve for a lifetime and then elect new members, never women. Now, we find that these artists, given both their age and position, were suspicious of change, and this led to great dissatisfaction among younger artists in France. Nothing was new or avant-garde. Now, under Napoleon and this new regime with the Bourbons, the grand machine, or big contraptions, very large canvases, were commissioned by the government and were the most successful sign that an artist had made it. Now, young artists began creating because we have smaller works that were not reviewed by critics and were overlooked by the public. They were dwarfed by large history paintings in this gentleman's hang, which is going to have paintings hung from floor to ceiling in the salon. So you look at the largest works, obviously. Now here we find the salons were dominated by David's pupils, but in 1819 to 24, there was a growing impact of Romanticism, we should note. One of the figures that would be instrumental in bringing Romanticism to France would be Germaine de Stael, who was a famous popular novelist at the time. Her novel Germany was banned by Napoleon, but was an international bestseller. There were illegal copies of the work in France. Now, she had spent 5 months in Germany on a trip and spread German culture and ideas, especially Romanticism, throughout France itself, especially the ideas of Goethe and Schlegel. Now, she would, of course, question France's cultural place in the world because France was not classical. If we look back at ancient Rome, it was actually Gaul, which was a backwards, barbaric place. And we find that the classical tradition was never really popular with the middle or lower classes anyway, but it did have a very rich medieval history. Now, the focus on the medieval past and Christianity was in line with the Restoration regime. Louis the 18th and Charles the 10th would trace their roots back to the Middle Ages and the Roman Catholic Church that would buttress the divine right to rule, thus supporting that they should be in charge. And they were in a very precarious position, remember, because France had already guillotined their last king. Append to that, this poet Henri Bayle, in his writing under the German pen name Stendhal, we have a sympathy for religion's appeal to the politically conservative at this time, and an emphasis on populist character and emotional focus. In other words, we see the ability of religion to influence the populace. Now, he would advocate for a new modern art that should have a soul and express some human emotion or spiritual impulse in a vivid manner intelligible to the general public. And how best to do that but using Romanticism. The school of David can only paint bodies, he would say. It is decidedly inept at painting souls. So Stendhal is going to be a romantic that is engaged with the present. Thus we see many contemporary history paintings coming out of this era in romantic works. And the appeal here is to the greatest number of people. And the way to do that is to appeal to them emotionally and use subjects that they can clearly understand and relate to. Now, there were three main pathways for French Romantics, now looking for subject matter. The first, as mentioned, would be the medieval, showcasing a tie to tradition and Christianity. The second would be looking to contemporary events, such as the Plague House at Jaffa. And the third would be Orientalism. Now, Orientalism was born out of Napoleon's invasion of Egypt and also being warded off by the British. Now, there was an interest in the Near East or non-Western cultures that came to be related to things that are the opposite of the West, that are excessively passionate, violent, and cruel. Thus, it justified European imperialism in the region just like today. The artist who died very young, who epitomizes these new romantic tendencies, would be Theodore Gericault. Now, his would be focused on tragedies of modern life, whereby he had three main works that he exhibited at the Salon of 1812, 14, and 19, dying at the young age of 33. Now, per what his next two main works we'll look at are featuring, we should note his love of equestrian themes and horses. During Gericault's childhood, he witnessed the rise of Napoleon, and it was only in his adolescence that we have the great imperial battles being fought with Prussia and Austria. So he aspired to be a painter of war scenes, much like Croix that we mentioned, as his role model. Now, his first military paintings were in fact his last for the Salon of 1814, completed months after the fall of Paris to Allied troops. And here we have his two pendants that illustrate the changing fate of France that occurred in merely a few years, his charging chasseur and his wounded cuirassier leaving the field of battle. In each one, we have the episodes right before Napoleon's fall and right after. So here, a chasseur is going to be a French light cavalryman who jumps away from an unseen attacker and turns instead to strike. Now, there is a strong sense of space here, as the horse is going to be moving away at a diagonal from the viewer. Now, the model, not surprisingly, is going to be that of David, but this is going to move beyond the limits of classicism because of the angle and the dramatic interpretation. If we are comparing it to that of Napoleon crossing the Alps, where we have another rider that is going to be on a rearing horse, one can see that the drama and the movement that pulls us in two directions is due to the diagonal organization. In David's, even though it is very romantic in one way, it is parallel to the ground and perpendicular to the picture plane. Therefore, we move directly across the surface from, in this case, right to left, as the horse rears up, slowing down and balancing the composition, but still we read everything on one plane. On the other hand, Gericault's chasseur is going to be at an angle moving into the image, yet at the same time pulling back around as the sword comes back to the horse's tail. Now, the spatial dynamics and the freedom of brushwork relate this to the Baroque, and especially Peter Paul Rubens and his animal paintings, especially his hunting scenes of exotic animals. Thus, of course, at angles to the picture plane, we have violent action showcased here. The dramatic action and spontaneity of the earlier work is going to give way in this later example with the cuirassier, an armored cavalry soldier with a firearm, to one where we have an anti-heroic treatment as the soldier retreats. Now, this is, interestingly enough, a member of Napoleon's feared steel hammer cavalry. Now, instead of attacking on the battlefield, he staggers down a slope, using the saber as a crutch, much as though he was injured, looking scared over his shoulder as he's trying to calm his horse, who also has been startled. So here we can see what they would have looked like on horseback and were part of this grand machine that conquered Europe for Napoleon. It is much less dynamic than Gericault's earlier equestrian painting, but it is also very much unprecedented as it monumentalizes, again, this is 11 feet tall, it monumentalizes the anti-hero, someone who is retreating, not conquering, not winning, not the hero of the story, the anti-hero. Now, we know that Gericault produced many sketches after the defeat of Napoleon, as seen here. Now, we find that the examples we just showed are not propaganda. They would have been unthinkable during the Napoleonic era, showing someone in Napoleon's army who is retreating. That would be just impossible according to this very carefully regimented and controlled propaganda machine that Napoleon created. Therefore, we have this lassitude with war in France. They are tired of it, and they are unwilling to shed more blood. So this has to reflect public opinion, unlike, once again, these other examples during Napoleon's reign. Now, in 1814 and 19, Gericault travels to Italy and improves upon his drawing and the human figure, and creates monumental multifigural compositions. The result of said studies would be his largest and most popular work, The Raft of the Medusa, equally anti-heroic. We have a contemporary event from history that just happened, centered on the male nude, in this case 23 feet across and 16 feet high. The subject is of the French frigate Medusa that was carrying colonists and soldiers to Senegal. It wrecked off the African coast in the summer of 1816. Lifeboats had room for only half of those on board, and that would have been the wealthy half. Now, a carpenter assembled a raft for the colonists and the low-ranking soldiers that wouldn't fit on the lifeboats. They promised to tow them to shore, but the lifeboats could not carry them, and they had to cut the cables to save themselves, leaving this group to die. There were 150 survivors initially that drifted for 12 days, and only 10% of those survived. Only 15 people out of the 150 lived to tell the tale. Survivors are going to speak of this account, one writing an account that was leaked to the press, and it was an instant scandal. The captain of the ship was an appointed Bourbon. Thus, we find that this was an example of nepotism. He had no experience being a captain, and the fact that he was inept, and the fact that the Bourbon monarchy was involved was a huge scandal here. Thus, this became a symbol for France, as a country adrift for a lack of a competent leader. There was never a subject of a monumental painting before this size. So before, we would commemorate episodes to glorify a ruler, like Gros Bonaparte visiting the plague house at Jaffa. But this is going to be a celebration of the magnanimity of and magnanimous nature of Napoleon, not focusing on the horrors necessarily faced by his men. So this is neither important as a historical event. So you find that this is not a significant event with significant people. So we find that here it's not really propaganda because we have the most common people. So the propaganda can't be elevating them. So it is a very interesting, again, anti-heroic work that we can see here. Now, the first example that he made, as far as a study, was to dramatically reduce the scale of the raft for dramatic effect. That being, he had a huge raft, more indicative of one that would hold 150 people. But it was not as dramatic, so he limited the size of it. He also decided on different themes, such as mutiny, cannibalism, and rescue, eventually combining all three in this element and this moment where they realize they're being rescued, but it's a long way off, and contemplating the scene of cannibalism that took place. Now, you find that to get the image as realistic and emotionally impactful as possible, Gericault is going to build a full-scale raft in his studio to study. He also is going to light the full-scale raft from different sides with lanterns to maximize the lighting for dramatic impact. In this case, a tenebroso or tenebrism, much like that I've seen in Caravaggio's work. So here in his early versions, or these early abbozzetto, or these early oil sketches, you find that he originally had the raft sailing just parallel to the picture plane with the ship very close to the survivors. Now, as he progressed, trying to capture something that was more and more emotional and dramatic and impactful, he then tilts the raft away from the picture plane into the scene, foreshortening it radically and moving the ship further back onto the horizon at the back right. You find that the clouds also become more dramatic and intense, and the waves are going to rise higher, and they are black at the left-hand side of this. He then also, to understand what dead flesh would look like, traveled to the morgue in Paris to make copies of dismembered arms and legs and even severed heads, so that he would be able to accurately show pale, emaciated flesh. Here we have a severed head series of coupled portraits that he's also famous for actually doing as well. All of these body parts generally pulled out of the Seine River of transients or destitutes that were not claimed. Therefore, we are combining this timelessness, all of these nude figures that are going to be uplifting themselves in this type of cacophony emotionally. And we have this classical nudity that's going to be combined as well, but with real elements like people wearing socks, which kind of takes you out of the element of, say, Greco-Roman classical idealism. So it is recasting here famous motifs in modern history paintings. Just as we discussed with the example of Gros, with Bonaparte visiting a plague house, we're recasting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. So we're doing the same thing here with the example with the raft and the Medusa. Off to the sides, you find the classical motifs that Gericault includes to ensure that this is considered history painting in the Salon and to be taken seriously by critics. Here we have a figure, a very muscular one in the classical melancholic pose with the hand in the head showing he is depressed as he's considering what they have done, that being they've cannibalized people they knew. But we have these nudes necessarily for history painting and to be taken seriously. You need to demonstrate that you were a master of male anatomy, much like Michelangelo going back to the High Renaissance. Now, the figures here are going to be arranged in such a way to maximize the emotional impact and appeal of this massive image. You find that we have counter diagonals from the dead corpse in the lower left-hand corner, whose leg is going to provide the diagonal line up through the figures, gesturing at the black sailor Jean-Charles, who is going to be flagging down the ship on the horizon. The counter-diagonal seen in the mast of this makeshift raft and the body in the lower right-hand corner that actually extends out into our space with this funerary shroud over him. Now, the offset asymmetrical pyramidal composition draws our eye and us into the scene from the lower left up through this body of figures, one piled on top of the next, until we get to the apex of this emotionally charged image where these shipwrecked individuals realize they will be saved and will not die. Similar to lessons learned earlier on with the equestrian paintings, we have the effect here maximizing the drama after he made studies of the raft moving at a straight perpendicular to the picture plane seen in the lower right, and realizing this is not nearly as dramatic as pressing into the image at a diagonal, looking at the small ship way off in the distance. The same design can be seen in his charging chasseur and Napoleon crossing the Alps. Again, one that's going to be moving at the exact parallel to the picture plane is not nearly as dramatic as one moving away from the picture plane. Now, this is not a classical subject. We find that unlike the neoclassical works, it is not cast in ancient guises. People are not dressed in togas, nor are we telling and glorifying the story of an exemplum virtutis. Instead, we have a modern history painting like that seen in Britain and that we've already seen painted for Napoleon. But there is a major difference here in that these figures are not significant. They are not rulers. They are not heroes. They are not religious figures. They are merely the colonists and soldiers that crashed on the way to French Africa to colonize this section held by France and the monarchy of France. Now, how does he do that? With the same techniques of the Baroque, that high drama approach, that exuberance of the figures with dramatic lighting, with compositions built around diagonals that come out and engage with us. The corpse in the lower right-hand corner, just like that of Rubens' Elevation of the Cross, is in our space, forcing us to realize that these people were real, they suffered, that they are just like us. And of course, we can imagine their suffering as well, thanks to the articulation by the survivors and how their stories are told and presented here by people like Gericault. There was mixed reception for the painting, as critics would not praise it because of the subversive political message, in essence criticizing the king. Therefore, he took it to Britain to show for a public fee, just as we talked about on the Pall Mall. But he would die of tuberculosis at 33 before making any more monumental grand machines that were anti-heroic, sadly enough. This is going to leave the field open completely for Eugene Delacroix, who would prefer the past instead of modern history and fictional exotic elements of fantasy. He complained that France was bland and ugly, quote, wretchedness of the modern costume making it so, because there was a lack of poetry in modern life. He instead would focus in on literature of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, especially that of Dante, Milton, and Shakespeare, along with modern romantic poets like Goethe, Byron, and Sir Walter Scott. An introduction to Delacroix should be his Massacre at Chios here, one of the most contested paintings at the Salon of 1824. It was criticized for its formal qualities and emphasis on agony and suffering. The episode shown here is on the island of Chios, a trading port, during the Greek War of Independence, where the Ottoman Turks slaughtered 42,000 Greeks, enslaving 50,000 more. 23,000 were exiled a year earlier by the Greeks, as the Greeks did the same to the Turks in Tripoli. It's an example of Orientalism and exoticism, showcasing the brutality and barbarity of a Middle Eastern culture. Here we can see the ideals of freedom and nationality, as the French sympathized with the Greeks here, who are going to be overtaken by a foreign entity. So we find that the military defeat can be seen here in ancient Greece, was paralleled by that of the defeat of Napoleon, but it was redeemed by heroism in the case of Bonaparte's visiting the plague house at Jaffa. This, on the other hand, with Delacroix and the Massacre of Chios, is unapologetically pessimistic. As Stendhal would state, it is on the side of excess. It lacks, in this instance, unity and focus, as the figures are randomly placed and scattered throughout, living and dead, the suffering intermingled with the dead and the living. Here we find the colors are now dark and muddy, and the commercially fabricated colors were subpar that he had access to. But originally it would have been very bright and loosely painted. Now, sketching with colors is one thing that Delacroix was known for. He did not make traditional pencil sketches. Instead, he thought in terms of patches of color, which will be very influential for later Impressionists. He also did not shade in white and black, like the neoclassical painters such as David did. Instead, the shadows are going to be of red, having complementary green, thus foretelling Impressionism and looking back to artists like Veronese and Rubens. This barbarity would be taken to an extreme in one of his most famous works and controversial works, The Death of Sardanapalus of 1826. In it, we have the subject of a modern romantic poet, Lord Byron, who also fought in the Greek War of Independence from the Turks. Thus, he is seen as somewhat of a Greek hero. So Sardanapalus is a narrative poem written in 1821, 5 years earlier, about an Assyrian king who was cornered on all sides and surrounded by his enemies, but instead of giving up, decided to destroy everything in his possession, including his harem of women, his war horses, and all of his gold and jewelries and refinement here. Now, Orientalism and exoticism, that being themes of the Middle East, are equated here to eroticism. We have the bare-breasted nature of his harem here, who's going to be killed in these exotic themes of barbaric behavior as he is witnessing the destruction of everything he holds dear in front of him in this megalomaniacal display. So as we can see, moving throughout this work, we have the war horse being dragged in the lower left-hand corner into frame as it is stabbed in the neck by this African. To the center, we have another one of his men stabbing one of his harem girls in the chest as she is being displayed to him. Up above, we have others throwing themselves on his bed, which is doubling as a funeral pyre that will burn him alive here in a moment. As you move off into the background, with others being slashed and stabbed, with a fire billowing smoke in the upper right-hand corner. The studies that Delacroix did, not surprisingly, imitate those that we looked at for Chios, in that he doesn't really do drawings. Instead, he does color sketches in this way. So the design, we'll notice, is going to be taken its cue from the earlier Raft of the Medusa by Gericault, as instead of moving like a neoclassical work in front of the picture plane, this moves back into the image itself, forcing us to crawl over these dead bodies and dying bodies, forcing us to come to a visceral understanding of what is happening, and that is sex and death, the barbarity they would have associated with exoticism in the Near East. Now, this is seen as sublime horror to critics at the time, who referred to it as satanic, with an imagination gone awry, as they would say, that simultaneously had an attraction, which of course is notable with all of the nudity, and a repulsion, as that is destroyed at the same time. As they would state, we have here displayed the delirium of his creation. He has been carried away beyond all limits. It was seen as far too much in many ways. Now, this is an example of the battle of ideologies and styles between Delacroix, the undisputed Romantic master, and the follower of David, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. Now, Ingres is going to be a student of David and a member of the Academy, and his classical approach went apace with Romanticism. He produced works at the same time Delacroix was working, and they were seen and compared quite often to one another. In the Salon of 1806, he produced this work and was criticized as it was too Gothic according to the Academy and perverse. So he traveled to Rome, winning the Prix de Rome for 4 years, and was commissioned to decorate Napoleon's residence in Rome by Napoleon's sister, Caroline Murat, the Queen of Naples, and was commissioned 2 nudes. He then comes back in the Salon of 1814 with 3 more works that was met simultaneously with indifference and hostility that we'll discuss now. So in his Grand Odalisque, a very famous painting in the Louvre next to the Mona Lisa, you're going to find a female reclining nude in the tradition of the Venus of Urbino. And even though this is a very classical approach to a nude that's bounded by these contours and very carefully outlined, we also are going to see the creeping in the interest of exoticism of the day. Again, the subject is going to be Oriental or of a Near Eastern subject with harem women. They represent the other, not good Western Christian women, but those that are there to serve the pleasures of a leader in the Middle East, of a sultan. So we have a glimpse into this exotic world where Western rules of monogamy do not apply. We find at the same time that viewers are intrigued and disgusted by what they see here. Now we find that Ingres is going to be inspired by the Attic classicism of Eustache Lesueur that we discussed in the Baroque era, that is going to refine and abstract the nude form and take liberties with anatomy. In this form of a dorsal view of this odalisque, which is going to be a harem girl, a concubine or sex slave for Turkish individuals, you're going to find that she looks over her right shoulder in an inviting fashion, holding a peacock fan in her right hand, crossing her left leg over her right thigh. At the edge of her right foot, you're going to have a hookah with smoke still pouring out of it and exotic silk drapery behind her. So instead of the frontal view made possible in the Venus of Urbino for this female nude, Ingres is going to ensure that we can draw a line carefully all the way around this form, but it requires some rather distortive aspects. So we know that the skin and the flesh is much less absorptive and translucent as in the Venetian approach to the Venus of Urbino. The hard elongation and ceramic quality comes from the Mannerist period and that of Bronzino here. But the theme is going to be one of the exotic Near East. Thus, even in these neoclassical artists, they are going to be appreciating subjects from Near Eastern examples, from the Turks, as men in the West are very titillated by this idea of a harem, of having multiple women that are there solely to service the sensuous desires of one man. So they are going to be condemning this approach as hedonistic and anti-Christian, but still they are drawn to it in this exotic fashion. It is no wonder that people have pointed out she has several extra vertebrae in order to actually pull down this sensuous, sweeping curve of her back down to her thigh. And then the way in which her leg is placed over the right leg is also going to be a contorted exaggeration. So anatomical correctness in this instance in France is going to be sacrificed for his interest in that continuous contour, that linearity that he will derive from Greek vase painting. The subject, though, and the point is the same as that of Girl Reclining, painted by Boucher, once again for Louis XV, in that it celebrates jouissance. It celebrates in this fashion aristocratic dalliance again, because of course only the incredibly wealthy and the aristocracy, as you have the equivalent in the Near East, could of course afford a harem. What we find here that is quite interesting is even though nudes were quite common in boudoir imagery like the Venus of Urbino, they were not very common in a public venue like the salon, and that's one of the reasons why the Grand Odalisque was criticized. Now, it is, of course, often cast in a mythological scene, even in private. We do not just see a woman laying on a bed, as Titian shows the Venus of Urbino. She is instead cast as the goddess of love. And so the difference that we have here with a woman that is shown in this exotic sense, not being a Western woman, but instead a contemporary, not in classical attire or in a mythological guise, from the East, being shown in this way was quite scandalous for many reasons. So here we can find that art is split in two at this time, leading up to the July monarchy. We have classicism and we have romanticism. Classicism representing the status quo or the official style of the academy, whereas romanticism is seen as avant-garde, as pushing the envelope, as Delacroix certainly did. Next class, we will see further evidence of both of these styles continuing in different directions during the July monarchy.